everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we are going to be asking the question, what is so bad about chametz? Why are we asking that question? Well, we're asking that question because the beginning of the fifth perek of Menachot starts with Kol ha-menachot ba'ot matzah. All flour offerings are supposed to come as unleavened, in an unleavened situation. Chutz mi chametz shebetodah u'shtei HaLechem shehein ba'ot chametz, except for the chametz that is in the Korban Todah, the Thanksgiving offering, and the 2 loaves of bread that are offered on Shavuot. Now notice, neither of those actually goes on the mizbeah, but nonetheless, they are the 2 outliers that are brought from chametz in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, what's so wrong about chametz? Well, because we're in the middle of a war with Iran, I would like to start by dedicating our learning to safety, success, and more safety, Be'ezrat Hashem. But let's figure out what's so wrong with chametz. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start by looking at the psukim in the Torah that discuss the isur, the prohibition of using chametz, having chametz even. And of course, the first example of the isur comes in the description of Pesach Mitzrayim, the first Korban Pesach that is supposed to be eaten in Egypt, the night of the Exodus. And in Shemot Yud Bet, Exodus 12, we find out, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. God said to Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, HaChodesh zelechem, Rosh Chodeshim, Rishonu lechem, L'chodshei Hashanah. It is Nisan. It is going to be the first month of all the months of the year. Tabril kol adat Yisrael lemor. Tell the Jewish people, Be'asor lechodesh hazeh, on the 10th of this day, V'ikchu lahem ish sel veit avot se labait. Everyone on the 10th of this day should take for themselves a lamb for each household. If they actually don't have enough people to eat a whole lamb, invite a neighbor. Everyone according to what they're going to eat. Tachosu al haseh. That is what you're going to contribute to the lamb. And then it describes, this is supposed to be a lamb without blemish. We find out you have to have it for 4 days. Then you're going to slaughter it at twilight on the 14th. And what are you going to do? There's no mizbeah, there's no altar. So you're not going to put blood on an altar. You're going to put blood on your houses. You're going to take blood, you're going to put it on the doorposts and the lintels of the houses in which you're going to eat them. And you're going to eat it roasted over the fire. You're going to eat it with matzah. There we go, unleavened bread. And you're going to eat it with myrrh. You're not going to eat it raw. You're not going to eat it cooked in water. Instead, you're going to eat it roasted, okay? You're not going to leave any over till the next day, right? So kind of the isser of notar, right? Not leaving a korban over. And this is how you're going to eat it. You are going to be ready to go. And then we find out, and that night I am going to judge the gods of the Egyptians. And here comes psukim Yud Gimel and Yud Daled. Well, really, Yud Gimel to Tet Vav. The blood is going to be a sign on the houses where you are. I'm going to see the blood. And I'm going to either pass over you or have mercy on you, protect you. And no plague will destroy you when I am killing the Egyptians. And this is going to be a day of remembrance for you. You're going to keep it generation after generation. And it is in this context that we find out, for 7 days you're going to eat matzah. But on the first day you shall remove leaven, right, from your home. Anyone who eats leaven, anyone who eats chametz, they will get curried, they will get cut off, whether it's anywhere from the first day to the 7th day. Now, I want us to notice that the first time we find an isur chametz, the first time we find a prohibition of chametz, it is in context of your home where you are giving a korban, right? It is in context of a korban pesach. So when we say chametz should not be compatible with a korban, this is actually the first place that we see it. The next place that we see it is in Vayikra perek bet. In Vayikra perek bet, we find out that Menachot should not have chametz or dvash. They shouldn't have leavened substances or date honey. Kol hamincha asher takrivu ladunai, any grain offering that you offer to God, lo teaseh chametz, shouldn't be made with chametz, shouldn't be made with leaven. Ki chol se'or v'chol devash, because no leaven and no honey, lo taktiru mimenu ishel Adonai, should be burnt as an offering to God, right? So this is really where we get it from, that we do not want chametz, and by the way, we also don't want date honey on the uh, given as a korban, okay? And then we say korban reshit takrivu otam ladunai ve'el hamizbeach lo ya'alu l'reach nichoch. They can be given as an offering of choice products with which, what do we mean by choice products? Are we talking about maybe bikurim for the dates? Are we talking about maybe the Shtei HaLechem, the first of the wheat offerings, where you can give it? But the point is, it does not go on the mizbeach. So once again, we see an incompatibility between chametz and a korban generally, or here, more specifically, the mizbeach, right? And moreover, v'chol korban minchatcha b'melech timlach, you actually, every korban mincha is supposed to be salted. V'lo tashbit melech brit Elohecha me'al minchatecha, you should make sure that you don't omit putting salt on your mincha. Al kol korbancha takriv melech. Every korban, you should offer salt, which is, of course, why we have salt at our table on Shabbat when we make hamotzi. But here is our second place where we see, sorry, chametz is not compatible, okay? We have another example when we look in Vayikra perek vav, where actually what we're talking about is the part of the mincha, the leftover of the mincha, that the kohanim get to eat. And what we find out there is v'hanoteret mimena, whatever is left, yochlu Aharon uvanav, Aaron and his sons should eat. Matzot te'achel b'makom kadosh b'chatzar ohel moed yochluha. They should be eaten as unleavened food, right? In the sacred area. They should be eaten in the enclosure of the ohel moed, the tent of meeting. Lo te'afeh chametz. They should not be baked with leaven, right? Even the part that the kohanim eat also has to be unleavened. Chelkam natati otam me'ishai. I've given to them from my portion, meaning just like the korban itself, right? The kometz is not supposed to be, or any other part, any part of the mincha that is going to be given should not be given chametz. Also, the part that is eaten should not be eaten as chametz. Kodesh kodeshimi kechatat v'ke'asham. This is considered holy of holies, like the sin offering and like the guilt offering. Okay. Now we have two more sources that we have to look at. And the two sources that we have to look at, now that we have seen that both for the first Korban Pesach, we were told chametz doesn't go with the Korban Pesach. You can't have it in your home, right? Two, and parenthetically, you heard me hinting to the idea that the home became an altar or the mikdash, because that's where you were giving the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim. Two, Menachot are not supposed to be chametz or devash, and they are supposed to have salt. Three, the leftover of the mincha that's eaten by the kohanim should not become chametz either. Now we have our two outliers, our Korban Todah, and we have our Shtei HaLechem. So in Vayikra perek zayin, we find out about the Korban Todah, which of course is a Korban Shlomim that brings loaves with it, and some of those loaves are chametz. This is the this is the teaching of the shlomim sacrifice that a person will sacrifice to God. Im al todah yakrivenu, if they are offering a thanksgiving meal, v'hikriv al zevach todah, along with the sacrifice, meaning the animal that's given for the Todah, there also be chalot matzot belulot bashemen, urkikei matzot mishuchim bashamen, v'solet murbechet chalot belulot bashemen, right? It's going to be given with unleavened cakes with oil mixed in, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and cakes of choice oil with oil mixed in, well soaked. And then the next pasuk tells us, al chalot lechem chametz yakriv korbanot. Along with cakes of leaven, the person is going to give it, right? Al zevach todat shlamav, along with the animal that has been slaughtered. So here we specifically find out, nope, some of these loaves are supposed to be chametz, dafka supposed to be chametz. And in Vayikra perek of Gimel, we find out about the Shtei HaLechem, the wheat offerings that are offered as 2 loaves of bread, again, not put on the mizbeah, right? 2 loaves of bread on Shavuot. We find out they should also be chametz. So Vayikra perek of Gimel, we have a description of a mincha chadasha, right? An offering of new grain. In pasuk Yudalid, we have mimoshvotechem taviu lechem tenufa shtayim shnei esronim solatihena chametz teafena bikurim lashem. Right? From your settlements, you will bring 2 loaves of bread, right? They're each going to have, or I should say, they're each going to have 2/10 of a certain measure of choice flour. They're going to be made leavened, and they are first fruits to God, right? It's like the first wheat grains to God, right? The first barley grains was the Korban HaOmer. This is back on Pesach, right? The second day of Pesach, and this is the first wheat, right? So here again, specifically telling you, you are supposed to be giving this as chametz. So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time trying to understand what is the issue with chametz that in general, number one, it never goes on the mizbeach, period. But in general, you can't even bring it, you're not supposed to use it in the Beit HaMikdash either, with the exception of these 2, Todah Korban, and which Todah, of course, it's the things you'd bench gomel for. That's what you give a Korban Todah for, right? And the Shtei HaLechem and Shavuot, right? So what's so bad, what's so problematic about them generally? And then why, in the case of these 2 korbanot, are they good to go? Okay, and I think it's important because, chametz is a pretty basic category in the way we think about Jewish life on the calendar and otherwise. So the first is, the Rambam suggests that this is supposed to be an anti-pagan polemic. He says, Mikivan she'ovdei avodah zarah, this is in the Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed. Mikivan she'ovdei avodah zarah lo hayu makrivim lechem she'eino chametz, v'hirbu lahakriv dvarim metukim, v'legael et korbanoteihem b'dvash. He says, because pagans never would give bread as an offering that wasn't leavened. And they also put a lot of sweet things in their offerings to pagan deities, like honey, right? He says, that's why we're not allowed to have chametz or dvash in our korbanot, right? And then he says, moreover, v'chein lo timsa melach ba'af echad mikorbanotayim. You would never find in a pagan korban salt. L'chein asar yit'aleh la'akriv kol suor v'chol dvash. Therefore, God, the elevated one, told us no leaven and no date honey. V'tziva she'hamelach yeh tamid. And more than that, that there should always be salt, right? So basically, what he's trying to say to us is, it's just trying to show that our korbanot are not pagan korbanot. They're different from pagan korbanot. Now, the question really is then, so why the outliers of the Korban Todah and the Shtei HaLechem, right? Meaning that's going to be the question. But what he's basically starting to tell us, and I think this is worth thinking about already, is that, well, actually, what do you think it means for people to always sweeten the korban, meaning the lechem that they give, to their pagan deities? What do you think it means for them always to have fully leavened bread? Is there some symbolism to the idea of putting in, of having it be leavened? Is there some symbolism of putting in dvash, right? Whereas salt is a different symbol, right? Meaning he's not saying that directly here, but it makes you start to think, right? Now it's interesting when you look at the Netziv, Rav Naftali's view to Berlin, he has a different take. And the Netziv, instead of going to, you know, a sense of differentiating from pagan worship, he goes for, well, actually, let's look at the products of Chametz and Dvash themselves. What do they actually represent? And he suggests that they actually represent people getting involved and making a change to nature. And that in the Beit HaMikdash, maybe that's actually the less people are interfering, the better. And this is how he describes it. Kichol sa'or v'chol devash, any leavening agent or honey. Kara hakatuv kol davar hamamtik umat'im et hama'achal devash. First of all, don't think that it's just date honey. It's anything that's adding a nice flavor, a sweet flavor to the food. That's what we mean by dvash. Al shem shehu rosh hamamtikim. Dvash happens to be sort of like the exemplar, but it's anything that would make it sweet. Uvasher shesaor hu emtsa'i han'asa b'dei adam. Lahosif al habriya she'habarei barach me'habarei barach al yedei tachbulot b'nei adam. And because a leavening agent is actually a medium through which human beings are adding on to what God created, right? And I love this language that he uses, al yedei tachbulot b'nei adam. Tachbulot, the strategies of people, but it doesn't always have a positive connotation, right? Mishum hachi, he's here hakatuv b'beit hamikdash. For this reason, Scripture warns us when it comes to the Beit HaMikdash, l'lamdeinu, to teach us dechol hamitkarev yoter laHashem, anyone who comes closer to God, ra'ui lema'et yoter b'tachbulot enosh, should probably be less involved in the strategies of people, right? Now, what exactly does he mean by that? Does he mean depend less on people because you're depending on God? Does he mean don't get involved in the manipulations of people? So he says if you want to go down this rabbit hole, in Shemot, he actually talks about that Mishum Hachi, he's here hakatuv al hachametz bepesach. That's why no chametz on Pesach. Mishum she'az zman hashrashat emunah b'leiv Yisrael, because this was a time when actually it was a time of trying to root belief in God and faith in Hashem in the heart of Israel, meaning this shouldn't be about human beings making things happen only, or it shouldn't be about depending on human beings. It should be about recognizing God's ability naturally. And then he continues, by the way, and says, Dvash is very similar because basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to add to and change God's creation. Now, he's a little bit in a pickle because what do you mean? You're supposed to add salt. Isn't salt also changing God's creation? So he says something so absolutely fascinating. He says, no. Here's what you need to know. Salt actually represents divine providence. What do we mean by divine providence? We mean God treating people according to their actions and rewarding them according to their actions. He says, melach, salt, is the perfect symbol for this because salt can be good or bad, right? Salt can actually taste gross if you eat it on its own, but it also can spice things nicely, and it also can help things not spoil. He says that's the experience of hashgacha, that's the experience of divine providence, where God, depending on if you're good, if you're bad, if you're a little good, you're a little bad, God can turn something spoiled into something good and decide what measure of good and what measure of bad. And so he says, yes, it's true. We don't want something that represents tachbulot b'nei adam, meaning people interfering. But at the same time, because it's a symbol of something that can be both good and bad, and even the same thing can be both good and bad. Maybe it starts off bad and it becomes good, right? That's a symbol for how God's hashgacha works in the world, right? So this is a different take. And instead of the way that the Rambam was saying, this is about the comparison between Jew and pagan, for the Netziv, this is about not getting too involved in thinking that human beings are going to control it all, right? You're going to make the wheat into bread and you're going to make something bland into sweet, right? Not thinking that you're going to control it all. It kind of reminds me of the Gemara that we talked about, or maybe this was actually the version of it was Midrash Rabbah, where we talked about Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus, and Turnus Rufus says to Rabbi Akiva, what is better, what humans make or what God makes? And Rabbi Akiva basically says what humans make. And the examples that he gives, one of them is he brings, raw wheat, and then he brings a loaf of bread and says, which one do you think is better, right? So it represents the ability of human beings to get involved and change nature and create. We don't think that's a bad thing in general, but it sounds like what it's saying is, kechol shemitkarvim, how depending on how close you're getting to the Beit HaMikdash, the idea is you're supposed to recognize that there are things that human beings actually don't have shlita over, don't have power over. Now, Rabbeinu Bachai, which different from Bachi ibn Pekuda, who I would say is probably the Rabbeinu Bachai that people learn more often. I don't know how much people learn Rabbeinu Bachai al Torah. I guess it probably depends where you went to school. We didn't learn a lot of it when we were kids. Rabbeinu Bachai is 13th century. Perish on the Torah, he says, nah, 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 nah. Chametz is Yetzer Hara. That's what Chametz is. I'm sure many people have heard this, right? Chametz is the Yetzer Hara. Why? Because it's arrogant and it's puffed up and it's arrogant and it's puffed up. Now, what's interesting to me is that he says Dvash is also Yetzer Hara. And the reason why he says Dvash is Yetzer Hara is because he says Dvash in Gematria is Isha. Dvash in Gematria is woman. Now, this is very interesting because, first of all, two things, right? One, you want to be very careful that even though there is such a thing as a sexual Yetzer Hara, certainly from men's point of view, in addition to women's point of view, you don't want to actually turn a person into the Yetzer Hara, right? You don't want to turn a person herself into a Yetzer Hara. And the second is, I think this is fascinating. As a woman, if you said to me, Dvash and Yetzer Hara, I would say, yeah, of course, you have Yetzer Hara for sweetness, things that are a little sweeter, things that are, moshech, they sort of pull you over. So, it's kind of a study in different perspectives on how you would describe this. But I do think when he says, Al derech hapshat, ki hakorban lechaper bo kol avonotav, a korban, the purpose of it is to atone for one's sins. V'lulei hamesit v'hamediach shehu yetzer hara, and if not for the yetzer hara, if not for the evil inclination, lo haya adam choteh, person would sin, v'lo haya tzarich lekorban klal, they wouldn't need to be giving a korban. V'hasor v'hadvash, hein yetzer hara atzmo. The leaven and the honey, those are the Yetzer Hara themselves. So you absolutely should not be what he says, tovel v'sheretz biado. You should not be someone who is immersing while holding a source of tumah in their hands, which would be what it would be like to be giving a korban on the mizbeah that has seor or dvash in it. Now, again, we're still now stuck and we say, well, wait a minute, but there is Yotzei min haklal, right? Now, of course, the Yotzei min haklal is Korban Todah. Yotzei min haklal is the Shtei HaLechem. Of course, they don't go on the mizbeah, but they're still used. So if you're going to tell me that they represent a Yetzer Hara, oy, oy, oy. Now, of course, Rabbeinu Bachai and the Rambam and the Netziv, they all have to figure out why. They all have to suggest why you're going to give a Korban Todah with Chametz and why you're going to give Shtei HaLechem of Chametz. They all have to suggest it. However, I think that in some ways, there's like there's a bigger story here, or I don't even know if it's a bigger story. It's just it's working on a different plane, I think, than these other explanations, right? These explanations of, is it to differentiate us from the pagans, or is it to have ensure that it's not tachbulot b'nei adam, the strategies of people, or is it because it's a Yetzer Hara? I want to introduce two modern approaches that I think they're connected to these other approaches, but they kind of touch something a little bit different from them. The first is from Rabbi Yonatan Grossman. I've recommended his book on Sefer Vayikra before. I will recommend it again. I believe it came out in English, if people are interested in it in English. And he says, Nir'eh, he says, you know what I think? Shetehei asiba lakach asher tehei, for whatever reason, lechem hachametz mugdar kelechem enoshi. Leavened bread is defined as human bread. Hulo matim lemizbeach. It's not good. It's not appropriate for the altar. Ela dafka l'reshut hadam. It's for the human province. Kach ola b'miuchad midin Shtei HaLechem sheyesh lavi b'Shavuot. He says this is especially true when you look at the Shtei HaLechem and you look at the two loaves of bread that we're supposed to bring on Shavuot. B'yom ha'chamishim la'anafat ha'omer al Yisrael b'hanafat ha'omer, right? On the 50th day, after we've waved the Korban Omer, meaning which was the first barley offering, second day of Pesach, al Yisrael lahavi lechem mimoshvotehem. The Jewish people are supposed to bring bread from their settlements, right? We read that pasuk Vayikra Kaf Gimel. Lechem shelahem shematzui tachat yidehem. Their own bread that is found in their hands, right? And basically what it's saying is, it is human bread. It's human bread that is kind of our bikurim, and it shows up to say, Hashem, thank you for this wonderful, bounty, and now we're going to be able to continue eating all this new grain from this year, right? Why is it chametz? Because it actually is supposed to come from the human realm in that situation. It's our bikurim, right? It's our bikurim. And he says, look, why do we think that chametz is human bread more than matzah? He says it must have something to do with the luxury that accompanies leavened bread. וייתכן שהדבר קשור בכך שהלחם מייצג את הציוויליזציה החזקה והבטוחה בעצמה. Look, maybe bread represents a strong, confident civilization, right? You need time. You need time to make it happen. You need the technology to make it happen, right? אך בסופו של דבר, I'm just skipping, יותר ממה שהחמץ מייצג מידה רעה, he says, I don't think more than chametz represents any negative trait, הוא מייצג את המידה האנושית. It just represents human, it represents a human trait, okay? It's not a problem. Chametz is not a problem in and of itself. It's human bread as opposed to unleavened bread, which is not. Now, he doesn't really explain the Korban Todah here, but at the very least, what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, wait. Before you say that it's pagan, and before you say that it's a representation of tachbulot b'nei adam, before you say that it's a representation of avodah zarah, it's just human. It's human. It's what humans eat. It's human, right? Now, I think it's interesting because elsewhere, Rabbi Grossman mentions that we have to make sure to realize that we're not feeding God, kiviyachol. When we do a Korban Mincha, and we did a shiur on the Korban Mincha, introducing it a while back, when we give Korban Mincha, we're not feeding God. We're actually giving something of ours, of our financials, before God, right? So maybe that's also part of why we don't want to give generally human bread on the mizbeah. We're not trying to say God eats what we eat. That's not what we're trying to say, right? There's another explanation that I really like, and I think I like even better because I think it goes further. It has more explanatory power, and that comes from Rav Yoel ben Nun. Rav Yoel ben Nun says, actually, both dvash, date honey, and chametz, leavened bread, represent the end of a process. Hasor hachametz v'chein hadvash, shehu dvash haperot hametukim, הם היעד והתכלית הסופית שעליהם שואף חקלאי המגדל מראשית עבודתו. When you have a farmer, what are they hoping? That at the end of the process of the farming, they're going to have bread and they're going to have fruit, right? And the fruit is going to be sweet. Halakha Chametz v'Priya Bashel, the ripened fruit, and the leavened bread, right? V'Matok, and sweet, meaning about the pre. Shnehem bitui mutzlach l'sof hatalich. They represent the success of the end of the process, the tachlit hanichsefet, the desired result. U'lefichach gam la'osher l'hatzlacha, wealth and success, libracha, l'shefa, blessing and abundance. Shel misha mesigat tachlit hanichsefet, for the one who achieves their desired goal. Umagiel sof hatalich, right? Who comes to the end of the process. L'umatam, on the other hand, hamatza mevatet atzirat hatalich be'emtzao terem higio letachlito. Matzah represents a pause in the process. It's not the end of the process, it's the middle of the process. V'hu b'bchinat chisaron hamitzapeh adayin la'ashlama u'lishlemut. And it represents something that is still lacking, waiting for, fulfillment and perfection. Af hamelach, he says, also the salt that goes on the korbanot, right? Mivate rishoniyut golmit represents some raw beginnings. Sheyad adam lo nag'aba, that human beings have not really made change in. V'chol kulo b'chinat matnat shamayim. It's all something that was given by God. Now, the reason why I love this explanation, because it explains everything. It explains why you would not be allowed to have chametz on Pesach. I mean, it's the beginning of their process of geula. It's the beginning, right? Rav Yoni would say you can't have chametz on Pesach because your house is supposed to be like a mizbeah. We don't have chametz on the mizbeah because that's human bread, and we're not feeding God human bread. We're not feeding God at all, right? That kind of thing. But here it would say it's the beginning of a process. And dafka the Shtei HaLechem is the end of the process. You have first the physical geula, and then you have the spiritual geula. Or if you don't want to put it in those terms, you want to put it in more biblical terms, you have first the beginning of the process of the harvest, and then you have the process of the end of the harvest, right? You're actually at the end. If you look at why it should be in the Korban Todah, of course, you went through a process of you were sick and you got better, you were in jail and you got out, you were in the wilderness and you were able to go through, right? Meaning these are things where you went through a process that, or a journey at sea, let's not forget that one, right? You went through a process that actually is over now, right? And you're at the end. Now, what I think is most fascinating, and I put this on the end of the source sheet, but I have to end this year because I don't want to go too long. What I think is most interesting is that Rav Yoel ben Nun's understanding offers us a unique way to look at the korban that a Nazir gives at their end of their Nazirut. Because a Nazir at the end of their Nazirut also gives some grain offerings, but those are matzah. And he actually specifically says, well, actually what that tells you is that Nazirut itself is not the end of a process. It's the beginning of a process, because the question is how the Nazirut is actually going to impact the way a person behaves after that. So suffice it to say, I'm not sure we're ever going to really get to the bottom of it, but this perek, which really tells us so much about chametz, I think it is interesting to consider the different possibilities here. One more time, just to summarize them. One, the Rambam suggesting that pagans used these things. Two, the Netziv suggesting that they represent human tinkering, right? And sort of human interference. Three, Rabbeinu Bechaye, that they represent a Yetzer Hara, right? Maybe even Avodah Zarah. Four, Rav Yonatan Grossman, that it represents human lechem, and that human lechem definitely doesn't belong on the altar. Maybe a few times it's going to come into play in the Beit HaMikdash, but it doesn't belong on the altar, right? And Rav Yoel ben Nun the idea that chametz represents the end of a process as opposed to the beginning of a process. So I hope that inspires you as you are learning more and more about the halachot surrounding menachot and chametz.